Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 8, Halacha 1 in the Art Scroll. This is 67A3. This is going to be a three-part shiur because of the length of the Gemara. Today we're getting into the 5 different types of Kilayim. Again, the Torah itself has in there 5 different types, and the Mishnah is going to lay out the 5 differences between one another. The usage that people have with them is going to be different, and also the punishments are going to be a little bit different depending on what you're doing with it. So the Mishnah is going to say like this: the Kilayim of the Vineyard. Again, that's the first one. That's Kalim. That's mentioned in the Torah. So Kilayim in the vineyard is going to be prohibited to sow or to maintain, and they're prohibited for benefit. Now, this is going to be where they're telling you that whatever you're doing with it happens if you're going to use it for some kind of thing like bringing for the temple. You want to bring wine to the temple. The idea is that this is going to be the most strict of the 5, and that you're not allowed to benefit from it. So we can see the seriousness of it. And again, you're not allowed to bring blemish offerings onto the altar. And we know that the wine does get put onto the altar. So Kilayim of the vineyard, you're not allowed to sow it. You're not allowed to maintain it, says the Mishnah. What's going to be maintenance? Well, there's going to be a Makkot about that on, if you had a grape seed and 2 species of grain and you're doing it in a single thrust of the hand, if that's going to violate the Doraita obligation. And what about if you had with a vegetable instead of the grain? What would that be? That's all a Makkot. We're going to be getting into that a little bit later, and you can see more about that in the Rambam if you want to see about Kilayim in his chapter 5 of Mishnah Torah. But the idea of what does it mean to maintain Kilayim, that's going to be vague. It's going to come up a little bit later today in the shiur. And really, the idea is does that mean that you didn't uproot the Kilayim? So maintenance is a very vague term. Maintenance means what? Does that mean that if you saw the Kilayim there and you didn't remove it immediately, is that maintenance? If you went ahead and did it purposefully and you just left it there, is that going to be maintenance? We're going to cover that later on today in the shiur. What is going to be maintenance? We're going to get into the next of the 5 sections. The Mishnah is going to say the Kilayim of plants. That we know is Kalei Zerayim. And again, you're going to see that there's a bit differences on this. So the Kilayim of plants, it says, are prohibited to sow or maintain. That comes up again. But permitted for consumption and certainly for benefit. So again, we saw that Kalei Zerayim, which is going to be, let's say you had Kilayim of grain, but it happened to be next to a vineyard. Well, your grain is going to be forbidden for any benefit, and you're not allowed to maintain it. But here we see that if somebody did the Kilayim of Zerayim, that you're not allowed to sow it, you're not allowed to maintain it. But if it was there, can you benefit from it? The answer is going to be yes on this. That's going to be different. So the idea is that Kilayim of plants is going to be permitted for consumption, also for general use. We're going to be learning about how you can do this from a juxtaposition about Zerayim and Kilayim in the verses in the Torah. We're going to get to that a little bit later. And so the idea, says the Vilna Goan about it, is that there's an analogy between these 2 forms of Kilayim, between the animals and the Zerayim. And just as Kilayim of animals are permitted for benefit and consumption, so too is Kalei Zerayim. Now we get into the next question. So the next question is going to be, well, can you maintain it? And can you get benefit from it? And so we also see similarities here between the Kilayim of garments. And so, that's shatnez. And so you're not allowed to combine it, you're not allowed to wear it, but you're allowed to benefit from it. That's going to be, again, you have a condition in the Torah that's connecting different parts of Kilayim together. We're to understand that the laws are going to be connected. So we're going to see that in the next part, where it says that the Mishnah talks about, this is going to be the 3rd part in the Torah, talks about Kilayim, is the Kilayim of garments, where you see that the Mishnah says the Kilayim of garments, that's going to be shatnez, are are permitted in all respects and only prohibited to wear it. So can somebody go ahead and create it? They can. Can somebody go ahead and sell it? They can, right? You can make Kilayim garments and you can sell them to non-Jews. You can even have a store where you're selling Kilayim garments, but you're not allowed to wear it. And in fact, in Vayikra 19:19, it says, "A garment of shatnet's mixture shall not come upon you." And so, basically, it's saying you will not wear it. And in other words, this prohibition is only going to be with wearing the shatnet's garment. But what about other things? Can you get benefit from it? So the Mishnah says that it's only prohibited to wear it. And there's another set of Gemaras that talks about, what happens if, you have, 10 coats over it, and then your 10th coat or 11th coat is going to be shatnets. Can you do that? The answer is no. What about if you had shatnets like on the bed? What about that? Things like that. And so, the worry is that, some of the fibers will get on you if you're sitting on like a shatnet's blanket or something like that, that as you sit, that the fibers move up and sort of go around you. This comes up in the Bavli and Masechet Sukkah. Anyway, the Mishnah continues, and it says about the next part, which is going to be the Kilayim of animals. Again, there's 5 parts in the Torah. This is the 4th one, and it says the Kilayim of animals. That's going to be where you've mixed 2 different species. For instance, you try to make a lion and tiger hybrid, which does exist. There is such thing. So this is permitted to raise and to maintain, and they're only prohibited only with regard to the act of cross-species mating. And in other words, the act of trying to produce them, that's what's going to be forbidden. Now, we see this in the Torah with Anna. Anna was the first one who tried to make the mule. And what was the mule? The mule is a sterile animal that is a mixture between a horse and a donkey. And he was also punished measure for measure, where Hashem created a special animal that killed him, that was also a hybrid animal. It's like a poisonous toad that's like a snake, like a lizard. And then the next and the last one is going to be with animal hybrids. And it says Kilayim of animals are prohibited to be mated with one another. So the idea is that if you have 2 hybrids of the same 2 species, but they're going to differ with their male and female ancestry. For instance, let's say you have a mule where the mother is a horse and the father is a donkey. That can't be mated with the opposite type of mule, one from the mother where the mother is a donkey and the father is a horse. In other words, by the way, that's going to be a hinny. So that's the English name. It's called a hinny. What's interesting about this is that when the father is going to be the horse and the mother's the mule, I believe that the offspring is going to be sterile, or maybe it's the opposite one. But one of the combinations makes a sterile animal. And by the way, like when you mix a lion and a tiger, those are also sterile animals as well. But even though the animal is sterile, you're not allowed to breed it. That's going to be an interesting point. Now, the Gemara gets into the first part of these 5 that the Mishnah was talking about. That's going to be the Kalam of the Vineyard. And as we saw, that it's prohibited to plant and to maintain. And the Gemara wants to see a scriptural source for this. And it says that it's written over in Devarim 22:9 that you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim. And from this, I only know of a prohibition upon those who sow Kilayim of the vineyard. And from where do I learn a prohibition upon one who maintains this Kalim? And the Torah is teaching that a vineyard shall not be Kilayim. In other words, it may not be maintained as such. Could be speaking about Kalei Zerayim, not Kalei Karam. That's what the Torah's Kohanim is saying, and the Vilna Goan is going to end up amending this text to conform with what I just said. In other words, that it's going to be related to the vineyard. The verse could have said, you shall not sow Zerayim in your vineyard. And we would have all understood that it prohibits the sowing of somebody's vineyard with Zerayim. That would be grain, legumes, vegetables. So let's get into the Gemara. The Gemara is going to talk about the first of the 5 different types of Kilayim in the Torah. That's going to be the Kilayim of the vineyard, and as we saw in the Mishnah, that is prohibited to plant or maintain. Now the Gemara is going to look at a brisa that's going to look for the scriptural source of these rulings, and it's written over in Devarim 22:9, where it says, "You shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim." And the Gemara continues and says, "From this I know only of a prohibition upon the one who sows Kilayim of the vineyard." From where do we learn a prohibition for someone who maintains this kind of Kilayim? In other words, you know you're not allowed to sow it, but what about to hold it, to leave it there, to maintain it? And the Torah therefore teaches, and a vineyard shall not be Kilayim. So it may not, the idea is that it may not be maintained as such. So what's interesting about the dikduk here is that the verse could have just said, "You shall not sow your vineyard with Kilayim," right? And we would have understood that, okay, you can't put vegetables in there, you can't put beans in there, things like that. But the term says tazria, and it also says zerayim. It's in there, and now it's adding in the word Kilayim. Why is the extra usage of the word Kilayim going to be in there? In other words, you could have just said tazria and zerayim, and that would have been enough. But it's not, right? It says at the end of it, at the end of this verse in Devarim 22:9, it says Kilayim again. And this extra word Kilayim at the end of Devarim 22:9 is there to teach this specific law that you're not allowed to maintain it. In other words, that the law has 2 ideas in it. First is that you're not allowed to sow, and the extra use of the word Kilayim in there is not to maintain it. Why? Because you created the situation of Kilayim by sowing it, and then the extra term Kilayim in there is the idea that you've maintained it, because it's in the status and the state of being in Kilayim. That's the idea. Now, the prohibition of maintaining Kilayim, the Mishnah and the Brisa are going to follow the view of one particular Tana, and it says, who are these teachings in accordance with? That's going to be Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva says in a brisa, one who maintains Kilayim transgresses a negative commandment. That's going to be a lo ta'aseh. The idea is that the Mishnah and the brisa that we see is by Rabbi Akiva is prohibiting the maintenance of Kilayim. And the idea is that, is this really going to be the halacha l'sina? Is this going to really be even the halacha l'maisa? And the rabbis are actually going to be taking issue with Rabbi Akiva on this. The opinion of the rabbis is going to be teaching that it's prohibited to weed Kilayim fields or cover Kilayim seeds with earth. So the question is, whose opinion is all of this? And there's a brisa, or the Gemara is going to say, whose teachings are this? This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva said in the brisa, one who maintains Kilayim transgresses a negative commandment. Now, this is going to be a little bit different on some of the points between what the rabbis are saying and what Rabbi Akiva is saying, but there's going to be agreement on something. So Rabbi Yossi says in this Gemara that the Mishnah accords with all views. In other words, both Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis who agree with regard to the prohibition to maintain Kilayim, and that it is indeed prohibited. The idea is that they're going to be disagreeing about lashes. Rabbi Akiva is saying that one who maintains Kilayim is subject to lashes, and the rabbis say that he's not subject to lashes. But the Mishnah is stating simply that maintenance is prohibited. It doesn't take a position on what you do with the lashes part. So that's going to be the opinion of the rabbis. And also, in a way, Rabbi Akiva, it's just leaving out the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that they get lashes for not obeying it. And the question moves on to another point between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva. And the dispute between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva is going to be where one maintained Kilayim without performing an action. In other words, he just didn't go uproot it. He left it there. And in the case where they disagree as to whether the transgression is going to be punished with lashes. So where somebody maintained Kilayim through performing an action, the rabbis are going to agree that he gets lashes. But where the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva are going to disagree is the difference between passive maintenance of it and active maintenance. Everybody's going to agree that if you've actively sown Kilayim dafka, you're going to get lashes. It's a form of rebellion. But what happens if, like, you come by and there's weeds there, or somebody planted there by accident, and you just found out that, oh, there's cabbage growing next to my barley? What do I do? Well, if you just left it there, or you knew about it and you just passively didn't bother to go deal with it, Rabbi Akiva's position is going to be that you're going to get lashes for that, even though it's a passive act of leaving it there. It's a passive act of maintaining it. And the sages are going to say that you're not allowed to benefit from it, but you're not going to get lashes. You're not allowed to do it. You're not going to get lashes on it. But they all agree that the active case of going and actively trying to make Kilayim, that's going to be in the case of this with Kalei Karam, that's going to be where you're going to get lashes. Now, I made a mistake when I said that. If your cabbage is next to the barley, well, this would be a case where your cabbage is actually next to your vineyard, right? Because we're talking about Kalei Karam, not Kalei Zerayim. Now, the Gemara is going to look at this other case about active and negative, or active and positive maintenance, and sort of passive maintenance. And they taught in the Brisa, one who covers seeds of Kilayim with earth is subject to lashes. Why? Because this is an act of maintaining it. And the rabbis are also going to punish it with lashes. So in this case, the Kilayim seeds were already placed in a hole, and the person just covered this with earth. So the Gemara would initially think that, well, maybe this is a passive thing. But the Gemara is concluding that actually the seeds were already planted. It's not an act of sowing. What the rabbis prohibited, says Rabbi Kanievsky in his commentary, is that the prohibition of maintaining Kilayim, and instead of removing the seeds, one allows them to remain by covering it with the earth. And since the transgression took a form of action to do it, that's where he's going to be liable to lashes, explains Rabbi Kanievsky about this. So the Gemara is going to continue with the next part, which is going to be Kalim of the Vineyard. It says that they're prohibited for benefit. And the Gemara is going to seek the source of the ruling. And it says, from how do we know that it's prohibited for benefit? This, by the way, is coming up in Devarim 22:9. And it says over there that it is stated regarding Kalei Karam, lest it become forbidden. And it is stated over there, over in Devarim 7:25, that lest you be ensnared by it. So the common words of the verses lest and lest is going to create a gezerah shava. In other words, that's going to be one of the 13 logical principles for hermeneutics in learning Torah, Gemara, and law, for Jewish law. So you could create a scriptural analogy between over here where it's forbidden in Kalei Karam and over here with the idol worship, because it uses similar phrasing. And just as this word lest is going to be stated concerning an object that's prohibited for benefit with an idol, so too the same word lest is stated here concerning the item that's prohibited for benefit. That's going to be the Kalei Karam. So the Gemara is going to actually look at a different source on how this is derived. And there are those who wish to say that it is stated here regarding Kalei Karam, lest it become forbidden, tikdesh. Now, where it says in the Gemara, there are those who say that's always referring to Rav Nachman. He was the last of the Tanaim, and he and Rabbi Meir were punished by Rabban Gamliel by having their rulings referred to as either others say, that's going to be Rabbi Meir, or there are those who say, that's going to be Rav Nachman, who is the Tana. And so he's saying that regarding Kalei Karam, where it says lest it becomes forbidden, tikdash, and it's stated over there regarding a man who engages in moral sexual behavior, and it says, and there shall not be wanton kadesh among the sons of Israel. And similarly, you have the wording of tikdash and kadesh, making an analogy between this and that. And just as the term kadesh is stated on a person who is prohibited for benefit, so too the term tikdash is stated here concerning an item that is prohibited for benefit. What's that going to be? That's going to be Kalei Karam. Now, the Gemara is going to object to where this one by that happens to be by Rav Nachman, the Tana, and it says, and is a wanton then prohibited for benefit. In other words, if somebody who went and engaged in promiscuous behavior, is that really going to be like somebody who's getting benefit from a field? How is that connected? So Rav Huna says that his act is a forbidden cohabitation that's prohibited for benefit. Why? Because he's getting pleasure from it. And the idea is that there's another source to derive benefit from Kalim, and there are those who wish to derive the prohibition from the following exposition. Rav Huna said the Torah states regarding Kalim, lest it become forbidden, tikdash, which is expounded as an acronym, lest it, Kilayim, burn in fire, which is going to be tukad be'esh, and this is teaching a requirement to burn Kilayim, which implies that you're not allowed to have benefit from it. So the verse is actually going to be reading that you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim. There's that extra word Kilayim in there, lest the fullness of your seed you sow become forbidden. And the Gemara is expounding the phrase as lest it burn in fire. In other words, it's revowelizing it. And so then the reason Kalim has to be burned is coming from this vowelization within the verse of Devarim 22:9. And so they're expounding the phrase in here, ten tik dash, as tukad ba'esh pen. So they're saying lest it burn in fire. They're in other words, they're vowelizing it differently. So the Gemara is going to look at a dispute regarding the prohibition to plant Kalim in a vineyard. And this, by the way, again, is in Devarim 22:9. It says, you shall not sow your vineyard Kalim. Again, that word Kalim is extra in there. It's going to teach an extra law. And this is teaching that one is not liable for teaching or for lashing, liable for lashes of Kalim unless he sows 2 species of foreign seed in a vineyard, and a single species in a vineyard, however, does not make you liable. These are the words of Rabbi Yoshaya. So according to Rabbi Yoshaya, the prohibition of Kalim applies when somebody plants 2 foreign seeds in the vineyard. This is derived from where the verse in here in Devarim 22:9, where it says, you shall not sow your vineyard Kalim. He's understanding this to mean that the vineyard may not be planted with seeds that are themselves Kalim with each other, like wheat and barley. So according to Rabbi Yoshaya, Kalim requires 3 species in total, 2 to be foreign species, and then the grapevine. And obviously there's going to be a dissenting opinion to that. And Rabbi Yonatan says that even a single species of foreign seed sown in a vineyard renders one of them liable, renders somebody who does that liable. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, says this Gemara, you can explain it like this. It's written over in Vayikra 19:19, your field you shall not sow Kilayim. And from this verse alone, we can derive both the prohibition, Kalei Zerayim, and that of Kalei Karim. And for what purpose then is it stated, you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim, which implies a separate prohibition for Kalei Karim. And the scholars are saying that the second verse is needed to teach a stringency regarding Kalei Karim. In other words, that even a single foreign species in the vineyard is going to render somebody liable to lashes. And that is going to be Rabbi Yonatan's source for this. So the Gemara is going to look at a question going back at Rabbi Yoshaya's view. And according to the opinion of Rabbi Yoshaya, the following difficulty arises, that the verse says regarding Kalei Karim, your field you shall not sow Kilayim, which teaches a prohibition to plant 2 species of seed, that's going to be grain, together. And for what purpose then is it stated regarding Kalei Karim, you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim? According to Rabbi Yoshaya, the prohibition of Kalei Karim requires 2 species of foreign seed, and its violator must always include a violation of Kalei Zerayim as well. And accordingly, then, the Torah is prohibiting Kalei Zerayim, and so the Gemara is going to try to resolve this, and the scholars are saying that the separate prohibition allows for an additional warning, and a penalty for somebody who's going to go plant Kilayim Karam. Accordingly, if the witnesses is going to be warning him, somebody who's going to be planting Kilayim Karam against transgressing the prohibition, where it says in your field, he's going to incur lashes for Kilayim Zarayim. And if they warned him also against transgressing the prohibition in your vineyard, he's going to get another set of lashes for Kilayim Karam. Now, the second verse is going to be in here, and it's going to be needed to teach, says the Pnei Moshe, a separate prohibition for Kilayim Karam, and that's going to have its own penalty of lashes. So somebody who's planting Kilayim Karam, if they're forewarned, they can actually become liable to two sets of lashes, one for transgressing Kilayim Zarayim, and one for transgressing Kilayim Karam. In other words, if you're planting wheat next to a vineyard, how many sins are you making? You're making two. You violated the Kilayim Karam for the vineyard, the vines, and also we know that on the seed for the wheat, you're not allowed to plant it next to another species. So the Gemara is going to give another explanation about this. Rabbi Bun Bar Hiya says that the verse is needed to give sowing the Kilayim Karam a different measure from that of Kilayim Zarayim. And there, in the case of Kilayim Zarayim, the Kilayim seeds are planted 6 tefachim from each other. But here in Kilayim Karam, the foreign seed, if it's going to be planted within 4 amos of the vineyard, it's going to be a violation. So without the separate prohibition of Kilayim Karam, someone who plants Kilayim seeds more than 6 tefachim apart, but within 4 amos of the vineyard, is not going to be liable to lashes. So the idea is that you violated the setback of the vines, but you're still within the setback of the grain. So again, the distancing on the grain is going to be 6 tefachim, and the distancing on the vineyard is going to be 4 amos. So that's how you can be in violation of one but not the other, right? So if you planted 3 amos away, you planted some grain, some wheat. Well, that's not within the setback of the wheat, but it is within the setback of the vineyard. You're going to be violating the laws of Kilayim Karam. But if you were to put this now right next to each other, right touching each other, now you're violating both. Why? Because you're within the 4 amos of the vineyard, and you're also within the 6 tefachim of the vines or of the wheat. So the biblical prohibition of Kilayim Zarayim is requiring 2 seeds that are within 6 tefachim of each other, and they're surrounded by a fence. And in the case of the Kilayim seeds sown within 4 amos of a vineyard, Rabbi Bun Bar Hiya is dispensing with the 6 tefachim requirement. It doesn't say anything regarding the requirement of a fence. That implies that even seeds within the 4 amos of the vineyard must be surrounded by a fence, and that seems to be very difficult because, is that really the case where you need a fence? Otherwise, it's not going to be Kilayim in a field. So what are we dealing with here, says the Gemara, in regard to the location of the fence? It says if the case is where somebody made a fence within the vineyard and enclosed 2 foreign seeds within it, then the commingling seeds in the vineyard is going to be negated, and the fence is going to separate the seeds from the vineyard, and then there should be no Kilayim Karam issue at all. And if it's going to be a case where somebody made a fence outside the vineyard and enclosed foreign seeds and the vineyard within it, then the fence is going to be a perimeter of the vineyard. In that case, you have a potential Kilayim Karam issue, and in that case, the distancing for the vines there is going to be 4 amos. So Rabbi Bun is basically saying that the seeds must be planted within 4 amos of the vineyard, but what about if there's no fence, right? Does it need to have a fence in order for it to still count? And so the Gemara says, what are we dealing with here with Rabbi Bun's ruling that you don't need a fence? It's dealing with a field of standing grain that serves to fence in a foreign seed. The Gemara is explaining that there was a field of grain there near the vineyard, and somebody cleared out a 4 amma area in the midst and then planted different species of grain in that clearing next to the vineyard. So the new seed and the standing grain are going to be more than 6 tefachim apart, but they're both within the 4 amos of the vineyard. Rabbi Bun is reasoning that the standing grain is surrounding the seed and is going to serve like a fence now to enclose in the grains and the vines. So question is, does standing grain serve as a form of perimeter? In other words, is that going to, because I know if you have a real fence, then the distance for grain is going to be, in some cases, 12 amos and not 4 amos. That's what this is going with. So the Gemara is assuming that the standing grain can serve both as a component of the prohibited Kilayim planting and also as a fence to cause it to become prohibited in the first place. Because again, in certain cases, if it's going to count as a fence, then the setbacks are going to be further. And if there's not going to be a fence, which is what Rabbi Kia's point is that then it changes your setback requirements. So the Gemara says this accords with that which Rabbi Hanina says, that which causes a Kilayim prohibition cannot serve as a partition to save plants from being prohibited as Kilayim. And the scholars of the academy inferred that which causes a Kilayim prohibition can serve to prohibit plants as Kilayim. In other words, that the standing grain itself can serve both as a component of Kilayim, and it can still serve as a fence to render Kilayim prohibited and change the distancing. So that's a big hiddush that we didn't know before. So according to the opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, there's a difficulty with all this. The Gemara says that it's written regarding Kalei Zerayim that your field you shall not sow Kilayim. And in this verse, the term Kilayim is needed to teach that you're not going to plant a mixture of seeds. And in other words, instead of using Kilayim not to maintain it, Rabbi Yonatan is saying this extra term Kilayim means that you don't plant a mixture of seeds. And it says, for what reason is it stated regarding Kalei Karam, where it says you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim? So according to Rabbi Yonatan, the verse could have been enough where it says you shall not sow your vineyard and didn't put the word Kilayim in there. So what does this extra word Kilayim mean over when it's talking about, because again, in talking about Kalei Zerayim with the prohibition of planting mixed seeds, the extra word Kilayim is there. And also when it's saying about your vineyard, the extra word Kilayim is there as well. So what do you do with this? And so the Gemara is going to resolve this. And Rabbi Hilla says regarding that verse which states that has this extra term Kilayim, it's so that you don't say, why do you say this? Because it's a way that the Torah is going to teach to say something explicitly rather than have it be inferred. And the idea is that the Gemara is going to follow up with another way to refine this explanation. It's going to say, or it's as that which Rabbi Zera said, that Scripture says you shall not sow your vineyard Kilayim. And that teaches the source for your vineyard, and that the grape seed that brings it into being, you shall not sow as Kilayim. In other words, had the Torah omitted the word Kilayim from that verse, one would have thought that the biblical prohibition of Kalei Karam includes the sowing of foreign seed in an already existing vineyard. And the verse is adding over on the vineyard side the extra word Kilayim there to teach that, in fact, when you're starting out a field to sow it, you're not allowed to sow it in that state as well. In other words, that the prohibition is going to be when there's a Kilayim of sowing a vineyard, as well as if you already have a vineyard there and even mixed seed there, you're not allowed to add more of it, and you're not allowed to maintain it. And so the point of this teaching about looking at the extra word Kilayim, both when you're sowing for Kalei Zerayim and also Kalei Karam, is that simultaneously the sowing is there to teach that it's when you're starting a field, but also for an existing field, and something that you can't do where there's maintenance either here or there. Have a great day.